attack. Those that broke against the Temple of Muses during the evening hours were probing the defenses, looking for ways in. The horde that seethed through the dry canals around the temple seemed heedless of their own survival. But they were not led by fools. The men shot down by Sabatian lasguns and Imperial fist bolters were sacrificed, and they now served to mark out the deadliest crossfires with piles of their bodies. The 91st Aleutian Lancers, infantry heavily supported with tanks and mobile artillery, reached the temple doors as the enemy was massing. Captain Lysander, who had learned siegecraft from the writings of Royal Dorn himself, had the Imperial Guardsmen bristling the rooftop and windows of the temple with lasguns, and the artillery lifted to the upper floors with chains, hauled by gangs of Salvation Penal Legions. Tanks rumbled through the ground floor, setting up as gun emplacements, and the rubble of the earlier battle. The 1179th Ground Wing Support of the Imperial Navy dropped cluster bombs in the canals and raked what enemy they saw with autocannon fire. But the enemy were sheltered among the storm drains and bridges of the Wiseman's Quarter. Castellan bombs scattered hundreds of mines across the murky sediment along the canal beds, and the stragglers and poorly sheltered died in their dozens to explosive rain. But the enemy endured. The Imperial Guard still spoke of the enemy as the Aristia, the forces loyal to the ruling caste of Opus. But it was obvious to many of the troopers on the ground that the Aristia had not ruled Opus, at least from the beginning of the Imperial invasion. More likely, the planet's moral threats had been pulling the strings since Lord Inquisitor Caltrops had arrived to hunt them down. Every soldier seemed to have signed a formless monster, or a witch wreathed in lightning, from the windows of the temple. Demons were said to be dancing among the enemy, and guardsmen swapped their certainties that witch covens were piling pyres of bodies high, and gates into the warp were being opened in shrines to dark gods beneath the Rakaba. The tide of fanatics broke cover after night fell. The guns of the Imperial Fist cut them down in such numbers that the next wave were wading through swamps of blood and torn bodies. The Dilution tanks hammered explosive fire into the enemy. Lysander ordered the Sabatian preachers to send in the Penal Legion troopers. A flood of combat drugs flowed into the veins of the Sabatians, and their entire strength swarmed out of the canals. They met the enemy in a brutal melee, a murderous crush with no way forward or back. The Sabatians were inmates of a prison world, and had been condemned for their crimes to fight and die for the Emperor. It was a fitting end for them, both a brutal punishment and a redemptive fate, and they brought back a few glimmers of the Emperor's grace in death that they had forsaken in life. Captain Lysander, the Dilution said, would do the same to every guardsman on the planet, if that was what it took. They crouched at their firing positions, watching the appalling bloodletting below, and thanked the Emperor it was not their time yet. The Imperial Navy craft shrieked over the canals, and dropped enough incendiaries that turned the dry waterways into rivers of fire. Thousands of enemy militia and Sabatians died. By the time the fire died down, the remaining waves of enemy had little to do except rush through the ashes and get shot down by Dilution lasgun fire. The enemy withdrew. Some of them were too crazed to retreat, and wandering the scorched battlefield, being picked off by Imperial Guardsmen on the temple roof. A few strange sights were revealed in those moments. Glowing, red-eyed, hovering creatures, witches or demons shrouded in darkness, gathering the remains of their army and ushering them into the drains and sewers under Rakaba. Several guardsmen swore they had seen a winged creature surrounded by a halo of silver lights overlaying the battlefield, as if calmly taking a tally of the dead. 4 gun crews were found dead in the upper floors, their eyes and hands later to be discovered heaped on the foot of a gargoyle on the roof, as if an offering. But the enemy were defeated at the Temple of Muses. The Imperial Guard knew better than to celebrate. A dozen battles of the same scale and severity took place across Rakaba that night. 12 city blocks in the orphans' ward collapsed into the natural caves and underground rivers beneath the city. delivering almost the entire Manacrave Hussar regiment to the hands of the enemy horde, with pallid white flesh and blank blind skin where their eyes should have been. A naval landing field, hastily built among the playing fields of Rakaba's university, was overrun by an enemy regiment who marched and fought in perfect coordination and were led by a towering warrior in molten steel armor. For every victory in Rakaba, Imperial forces suffered a catastrophic defeat. Rakaba was no more willing to give itself up than Kazale, and Operation Kaladas was following Operation Requiem and becoming a grinding cycle of murder. In the Temple of Muses, 2,000 guardsmen from the Luthermark Death Worlders Regiment arrived to reinforce the Delusions. Together, they patched up their wounded, carried off their dead, and tried to keep their thoughts from turning to what the next night might hold. Golgothian found Lysander in the grand reading room, the lavish domed auditorium where Opus's greatest scholars had once found court. Now the Imperial Fists were using it as their command post, with VoxNet boosters bringing in information from the Space Marines elsewhere on Opus. Lysander looked up from a parchment map of Rakaba that had been found among the temple's library stacks. "Golgothian," he said, "I thought you lost." "Lost no longer," replied Golgothian. "Now I am among brothers." Lysander looked Golgothian up and down. "Where is your weapon?" "She lies in flames in the jungle," replied Golgothian, "the last of her kind. And now there will never be another. But you speak of my bolt gun, Captain. That lies there too, along with the body of my battle brother Kibriones." "He will be mourned," said Lysander, "as will the Sanctifier." "And how goes the battle here?" Lysander glanced through the archway, leading to the main floors of the temple, where the Delusion guardsmen were hauling artillery pieces into place and handing out power packs for lasguns. "The enemy will try again tonight, and again, until the defenders break. The Temple of Muses will hold if the enemy numbers run out. But without any such end in sight, it is the duty of these soldiers to bleed the besieging force of as many men as they can." "Then Rakaba will become a quagmire," said Golgothian. "When we came to Opus to take its cities in days." "You speak most freely, brother," said Lysander, "as if you do not trust victory will belong in the Emperor. Do you have some greater insight, which I and the Imperial commanders do not?" Golgothian held up a hand. "Forgive me. I have seen my brother dead, my mission failed, and my steed fallen. I forget myself. But I do have intelligence that the others do not. In the jungle, some way from Rakaba, lies an installation surrounded by defenses well beyond the capability of Opus. It was these defenses, an energy weapon, that brought down the Sanctifier." "And what is this installation?" said Lysander. "Something that someone wishes to protect against intrusion," said Golgothian. "It destroyed my craft, and those of the Aristia alike. Someone who is neither a part of the Imperium nor of Opus's rulers places great value on something in that jungle." "I see," said Lysander. "This must be thought on. Yours is not the only such evidence that we have come across. For now, brother, join Sergeant Kirev and find a weapon. We will need every gun tonight." "Captain! Sir!" came a voice from the archway. A Delusion with a badly wounded right arm stood there, evidently dispatched as a messenger. "Speak," said Lysander. The guardsman looked terrified, to be in the same room as a space marine. "The enemy are sighted. They are moving through the buildings adjoining at every level." "Another test," said Lysander. "They know how we will react to an assault in the open. Now they fight room to room. Golgothian, find Kirav. He should be at the roof level. Go." The Temple of Muses was suddenly wound up for war. The Delusions were at their firing positions, leading one another in prayers of deliverance from the enemy, or calling on the emperor to guide their guns. Many of them ignored Lysander as he walked among them, wrapped up in their thoughts and fears of the coming action. Already the sounds of war, a constant din, thunder from elsewhere in the city, was going closer. Squad Sesfin was stationed on the lower level, and the Delusians there offered thanks to the Emperor that they would fight in the presence of the Space Marines. Sesfin, ordered Lysander, man the lower floors. Form up for volley fire. Fall back to the fountain rooms if you are surrounded. Understood, Captain, said Sesfin. His tactical squad, 10 bolters strong, was the best line of defense the Imperial forces in Rakaba had. Lysander, ascending a spiraling marble staircase that led to the temple's upper floors. He had escaped assault in the earlier battle. That would not be true for long. The enemy was acting in the way that all besieging forces with superior numbers would act, using their great numbers to test the defenders. Seek weaknesses at every level with repeated attacks, even if just to drain the ammunition and the will to fight off the defenders. The upper floors held museum and gallery rooms. A few of the portraits had been torn down or stolen. A few display cases of royal jewels and regalia smashed open and looted, but most remained. What looter had anywhere to take them? Kirev's squad were up here, among the rafters of the temple, along with the spotters of the Delusian artillery and a few Imperial Guard snipers. Brother Stentor was leading the battle site pre-battle rites. Each of the squad had his bolter laid on the floor in front of him, gleaming from the war gear rituals that kept them in the best working order. Each man's armor had been cleaned of the inky filth of the morning's battle. Even the white trim of their golden power armor shone, to denote their status as veterans of the First Company. Stentor's words were Royal Dorn's, taken from one of the many volumes of battle speeches he had left to the librarian of the chapter. Every battle brother knew them by heart, but when they were spoken before battle, they all heard them, as if for the first time. "There is no enemy," said Dorn, his words relayed through the ages by Brother Stentor. "The foe on the battlefield is merely the manifestation of that which we must overcome. He is doubt and fear and despair. Every battle is fought within. Conquer the battlefield that lies inside you, and the enemy disappears, like the illusion he is." "Amen," said the battle brothers of the squad, their heads bowed. "Captain," said Kirev, looking up, "what are your orders?" "Hold the rooftop," said Lysander. "I will be with you." "Then we shall do as Dorn did on Terra," said Brother Burns. "We will cast the enemy from the battlements." Through the rips in the floor, Lysander could see the skyline of Rakaba, picked out in the dying light. The parade ground nearby was burning, with Imperial Navy fighter bombers in the fire, beside the improvised landing strip. Guardsmen were already swapping stories about the demons conjured there, leaping monsters who bled flaming blood, and hung their captives from gibbets of twisted thorns. The Butcher's Vale, where thousands of tiny workshops and forges cramped over one another along mazes of narrow streets, was a dark, seething mass, obscured by smoke from dozens of fires. There the enemy were sheltering, almost impervious to Imperial artillery, and several thousand Galthmorian guardsmen were manning the barricades to keep a cordon around the whole district. The stadium of the Amethyst burned, a lake of fire from which the incandescent wing shapes flitted above the sky. The spiraling dome of the Tower of Rats was half collapsed, covered by a seething caul of mobile darkness. The city of Rakaba was devolving into 100 battles, each one a grinding drain of manpower. This was not a battle that could be won, because the enemy did not want to win. The battle was an end in itself. The enemy objective in both Kazale and Rakaba was simply to fight. They were not trying to expel Imperial forces, just draw them in and keep them battling over every street and building. Lysander had seen enough sieges, and learned enough from the volumes of battle lore Royal Dorn and countless Imperial Fist heroes had penned to see that, even though the enemy wanted him to fight, he would have to oblige them. From across the rooftops adjoining the Temple of Muses were leaping hosts of mutants, their bodies long and loping, whooping and shrieking as they bounded from gargoyle to chimney stack. They stuttered through the air, their unstable forms skipping across reality in impossible trajectories. They carried two-handed swords and axes looted from some Aristia household's armory, and they were followed by bright trails of blood and sparks. Their skin was stretched haphazardly over altered skeletons, and tiny wriggling creatures swarmed from their rib cages. Lysander swung himself onto the roof. He could hear the orders of Sergeant Kirav and the cocking of bolters. He took the Fist of Dorn in both hands, ready to drop it in guard or lunge into a strike. The enemy closed. The farce would have one more scene before the Imperial Fists could strike out and find the truth. If Lysander had to lose himself in battle for a little bit longer, then that was what he had to do. The mutants shrieked. The closest had a contorted, elongated parody of a face, cackling imps spilling from its grinning jaws. Lysander swung the Fist of Dorn into it, and took comfort in the breaking of its bones. Dephobus read their thoughts, this time not by tearing them from the prisoners' minds, but by letting them come to him. The lower level of the Merciless's brig lacked the psychic defenses of the cell where Filthhammer had been kept, and the inmates were captured militia of mutants without psychic abilities. Nevertheless, the first sight of them illustrated how dangerous they were. One vomited a constant stream of biting insects, which now were captured and drawn off by the drain installed in the cell. Another had oozed through his bars when he was first imprisoned, and was now sealed in transparent cylinder, with no opening through which malleable forms could escape. Perhaps the most striking and brightly patterned skin, like that of a venomous lizard, which was appropriate, given that his blood was highly poisonous, flammable, and rather radioactive. He was welded into a void suit, normally used for operations in vacuum. 24 militia were imprisoned in this brig floor. Most of them had crept to the back of their cells, where they had seen Dephobus. A few had pushed against the bars of their cells and hurled insults and threats at him. Dephobus sat in the center of the brig corridor, on the steel floor. He bowed his head and allowed the first doors of his mind to open. From this exercise, he constructed in his mind a fortress, and the Imperial Fist standing on the battlements, and a great black gate. The walls were hundreds of meters high and impossible to scale, and the foundations plunged down further than anyone could dig. The gate was the only way in. The minds of the prisoners were outside the fortress. Dephobus controlled which ones he would let in, and which he forced to remain outside. He imagined them lined up outside the gate, and himself a castellan on the battlements, looking down on them and judging them. None of them were completely human. Even those who looked outwardly normal had deformed, discolored minds. Some he instantly turned away, for they were roiling, mindless bundles of anger and fear, and they would tell him nothing. They thrashed about in protest, so Dephobus threw cages of black iron around them and sank them into the ground. They were banished from his mind, and would find no way in. Others stood proud and fearless. Dephobus discarded them too. They did not fear him. Fear was one of the greatest weapons a space marine could wield. Whole worlds had surrendered when they saw the strike cruiser of the space marines hovering in orbit. The fearless ones were irrevotably insane, and would try to confound Dephobus with lies. They were useless to him too, at least until their souls were broken. The rest, the desperate, the miserable, the terrified, and the crushed, he let in. The black gate swung open, just wide enough for them, and the gun sights of his mental guardians, the captains filed in, heads bowed. Manacles constrained them. The walls closed in and held them fast. The floor dropped away, and they were held, suspended, as the phobist walked among them. The image he created for himself was a fusion of man and machine, a tall, muscular creature, with limbs altered to incorporate every tool of interrogation that could be imagined, and many that could not. He glided on a dozen segmented legs, beneath a skirt of skin. His eyes were huge and multi-lensed, so he would miss nothing. As he bent over the captives, he could see their fear. On one level, the fear was a particular configuration of brainwaves, picked up and intercepted by Dephobus' psychic talent. On the level he envisioned, it was blood that ran from their eyes, a physical manifestation of mental injury. "Tell me everything," said Dephobus to the first captive. Then he went to each of them in turn, bending over them so they could see the surgical tools he carried in the infinite depths of his eyes. "Tell me everything!" And they did. One of the greatest challenges facing the interrogator was that once a subject gave up the defense of his mind, the information then had to be sorted. The great majority of it was useless. He glimpsed snatches of childhoods on Opus, and from it was enough to confirm that the peasants and the Aristia had such markedly different experiences. It was like reading the minds of two different species. The peasants were steeped in the idea of inferiority, that there was something wrong with them from the moment they were born, and that the Aristia were their betters in every way possible. The Aristia, meanwhile, were harried by a desperate corruption, a sort of social panic, in which they maintained their status by ever more wanton expenditure and acts of oppression. They turned themselves into miserable, obsessed people, islands eternally disconnected, ripe for turning to a dark cause, perfect chattels for those who could control them. It was remarkable that Opus had taken so long to become prey to the Dark God's champions. Dephobus wondered if moral threats were always held in Opus. But no, the moral threats were new. He could taste that in their minds. He had a feeling of a previous age, not long ago, still grim and devoid of happiness, but one now fondly remembered like a golden-hued youth. Darkness had come to Opus. Each captive had the same concept of time. 5 years. He could be no more accurate than that, given the ragged state of the prisoners' minds. 5 years ago, something had come to Opus, and in its wake followed moral threats from off-world. There had been dark things on Opus before, pleasure cults and rebels who had sought supernatural aid, but nothing like this. Opus was invaded, and silently, without mercy or pause, a power structure had embedded itself in Opus's society, above the level of the Aristia. The Aristia still ruled, but the planet's new lords permitted the Aristia to exist. When the Imperium had arrived, the mutations began. The new lords were seen in the open. Dephobus recognized in the prisoners' memories the moral threats Chikipov's staff had held briefings on. A glowing winged woman. A glowing winged woman reported during the assault, supported by the Sanctifier. A thing like an enormous spider with a human face that was recalled holding thunderous, hypnotic sermons somewhere in Kazeo. Even Filthhammer glanced holding a great sacrificial rite on the eve of the first Imperial assaults. Dephobus let his mind withdraw. The captives fell away, back to their own bodies. The brig corridor swam back to view. Why were they here? What was on Opus that they wanted? And who? Who had brought them? Booted footsteps caught Dephobus' attention. He was on his feet as the brig's heavy blast door slid open. "Librarian!" said Commander Chikipov, who walked in flanked by a pair of intelligence officers. He wore his full uniform, and Dephobus wondered if he was ever out of it. "The battle in Rekaba continues." "So I understand," said Dephobus. "I have seen the dispatches for the day. The enemy will not relinquish, that much is proven." "And the Imperial fists have abandoned their post," said Chikipov. It was stated as more of a fact than a rebuke. Dephobius folded his arms and looked down at the commander. At his full height, he dwarfed Chikapov. He was probably more massive than Chikapov and the two officers put together, but Chikapov did not back down. The implication of your words, said Dephobius, is most grave. Facts, librarian, said Chikapov. Nothing more. The Temple of the Muses held during the night, and in the morning the Imperial Fist left. It is now defended only by Imperial Guard, who are being reinforced as we speak, replied Dephobius. That is not my point, librarian. As you know, the plan for the invasion of Akaba was drawn up in the belief that the Imperial Fist would be a part of it. Now they are not. When my best soldiers abandon me, they become worse than no soldiers at all. Your soldiers. Dephobius took a step closer to Chikapov. We are not your soldiers. We belong to the Emperor and to the legacy of Royal Dorn. We hold our own council, and we fight our own battles. Our commander is Captain Lysander, not Chikapov. You knew when you requested our aid that the Imperial Fists were an independent force, a sovereign and autonomous chapter, who owe loyalty to the Imperium, but obedience to no one. And where are your battle brothers, Imperial Fist? We hold our own council on that, too. Chikapov had not risen to his rank by losing his composure when he was crossed. Come with me, he said, unless you have urgent business among the vermin. Dephobius followed Chikapov to the command. Dephobius followed Chikapov as the commander walked out of the brig. He was trusted by Lysander to act as a link between the Imperial Fist and the rest of the strike force, and the insult of being given such a blunt order by Chikapov could be ignored for now. Chikapov led him up to the command deck, where only a couple of officers now sat at the huge conference table, poring over reports from the battlefield. Here, said Chikapov. With a gesture, he activated the hull servitor, where it scrabbled along the ceiling. Its metallic torso split open, and the lenses of the hollow projector lit up, casting a strategic map of Opus over the table. The Kazail and Rakaba fronts, said Chikapov. Operations Requiem and Catullus. Already my reserves are committed, maintaining the corridors and policing the refugee camps, and arriving in orbit within the next 72 hours, reinforcements to be deployed immediately. The map shifted, now showing new attack lines around the continent of the plains and river deltas to the north of Kazail, leading up to the tundras, then to icy waste towards the pole. The third front, said Chikapov, the population not contained in the cities is being bled out of their towns and villages northwards. We don't know where. The Aristia are wielding now into armies, millions of them, librarian. It will take everything I have to pin them in and keep them from gathering into a force that could besiege Kazail and sweep us off this planet. And your chapter are off fighting your own war. Do you understand why I must have every soldier on this planet fighting as I deploy them? If any front collapses, we are lost. Any battle could turn the tide of the war, and the Imperial Fists can turn the tide of any battle. Do you think we are ignorant of this, Commander? Said Dephobius. We arrived here willing to follow your orders, because the enemy was clear. The killers of Inquisitor Keltrops had to be rooted out and punished, and Opus's government torn out and replaced. But this war is no longer so simple. We do not know who the enemy is. We do not know what he wants or who we can trust. Answering those questions will do much for victory on Opus, as 1 million Imperial Guardsmen. Chikapov looked at the strategic map. The deployment of well over 500,000 Imperial Guardsmen was allocated to the Third Front, with the same again in Kazail and Rakaba. Thousands of tanks and artillery pieces were scheduled to drop in orbit, and vast landings in the trackless terrain of the northern continent. "I know I cannot command you," said Chikov, "but can I appeal to your honor?" "Our honor is satisfied only in victory," said Dephobus, "and we will pursue it in the way Captain Lysander sees fit. There is nothing further to discuss." "Then leave my ship," said Chikopov. "It will damage morale if it becomes known that Space Marines and the Imperial Commander are not of the same mind. I will not allow that rot to set in. Join your battle, brothers, and report back to me when you are willing to fight my war." Dephobus left Chikopov in the gloom of the command deck, absorbed in the potential battles marked out in the hololithic map. Nameless plains and gullies, which would soon be the graves of thousands of men. Scout Sergeant Orphos' arm had not been fully accepted by his body. The muscles and bones of his upper arm still had to bond fully with the new bionic. His forearm and hand were now fashioned of dull metal, articulated with servos and cabling. The feedback was buzzing metallic, an alien feeling that he wondered if he would get used to, and phantom pains flashed through the nerves that were no longer there. His arm hurt now, as he crept along ahead of the main force, knife in his bionic hand as he scanned for booby traps. A scout learned rapidly about tripwires and pits, training his enhanced vision to pick out subtle anomalies that might indicate a grenade rigged in the undergrowth, or a dreadfall trap amongst invisible foliage. The jungle was dark. Beams of sunlight reached through the many layers of the canopy, but they were few. Sound was everywhere, the endless chirping and humming of insects, the almost human shrieks of hunting birds, and the howls of predators. The wind picked up, and the trees overhead sighed among each other with a sound like the ocean. Among the movement of the wind and of the creatures that flitted out, just out of sight, Orphos strained to pick out a target. Inarin and Privar were spaced out, almost too far to see, advancing at the same pace. Vontrez was dead, buried up in the mountains, and Grayus was at Sigismund Point, missing a good chunk of his spine and several organs. He would probably live, but he might never fight. A structure loomed up from the trees ahead. "Halt!" boxed Orphos quietly. He could just see Ephron through the trees, crouching to scan the terrain ahead through the scope of his sniper rifle. The structure was a tower, rising almost as tall as the canopy, draped with hanging vines and moss. It was metallic, segmented like a column, with ribbed cabling running down one side. Cylindrical structures were half buried in the ground around it. "There's a structure up ahead," boxed Orphos. "I think we're here." "Get closer," came the reply from Lysander. "Verify it's safe to move up. And remember, brother, something here brought down the Sanctifier." Orphos moved closer. Beside the tower was the charred wreck of a fighter craft. Not the Sanctifier, but one of the Aristea's own naval flyers. It had been sliced in two, and the two chunks had slammed to the jungle floor. A shaft of sunlight still fell through the hole in the canopy the fighter had torn as it crashed. "It's an energy weapon," said Orphos. His eyes followed the power lines from the buried generators up to the tower. "An air interdiction system. It's standard template construct pattern. It's advanced, but I still recognize it. Then it's Imperial." "Originally, maybe." Orphos stepped over the tangle of thick roots underfoot. The dirt gave way, and he stopped before his foot sank in. He scuffled the surface away. A skull looked back at him, jumbled together with the ribs and limb bones from many more bodies. "Got a mass grave here," said Orphos. "Here too," said Inarin. He could see Privar through the jungle. The scout's arm was braced as his broken bone healed. "Lasgun wounds to the back of the skull." A creature with a feline shape and scaled hide slunk out from behind the tower. Its lean musculature undulated under the reptilian skin, and four amber eyes focused on Orphos. Its tail curled up over its back, and it crouched low, shoulders meeting over its head, bunched up ready to strike. Orphos didn't move. Sleep-taught instincts weighed up the predator's combat capabilities. It had 6 limbs, the back pair powerful enough for both leaping and raking prey on the ground. The teeth were long and slender, for latching onto an adversary's neck and severing the spine. Its place at the top of the food chain had honed it into a sleek and efficient killer. The creature darted out of Orphos' sight, gone with barely a rustle of the leaves. Orphos hadn't moved. Something else had spooked it. Orphos whirled around. A section of the jungle floor powered up. It was the roof of a concealed bunker, forced to the surface by hydraulics. Revealed was a compartment in which was crouched a mass of muscle and machinery. Orphos identified autoguns unfolding. "Servitors!" foxed Orphos. He didn't have time to elaborate before the servitor's armored cranium turned to him, lenses whirling. Orphos vaulted a bank of entangled roots and dropped to the ground on the other side. Gunfire opened up and slammed into the roots. Splinters burst everywhere. He glanced at the servitor through the roots. It was built for toughness, not mobility. With wide shoulders and short, heavy legs, the head unit set low in the chest. Orphos rolled out from behind cover and ran, head down, past the arc of fire. The autoguns hammered shots past him. Orphos grabbed the upper edge of the servitor's shoulder guard, swinging himself into its back. He blasted into the thick spinal column with bolt pistol, and black hydraulic fluid sprayed. The servitor bucked like an animal, Orphos losing his footing and barely hanging on. He rammed the tip of his knife blade between the ruptured plates of its back and twisted. Sparks fountained over him. The servitor threw its body forwards, and Orphos was catapulted over its head, tearing over a handful of armor as he fell. He rolled as he landed, up to one knee. The 4 guns were trained on him. The servitor's skull was exposed, red and raw, the armor plating pulled away. Some echo of a face was there, the face of a condemned man or woman who had been converted into this machine, their brain programmed with orders, their nervous system hooked up to weapons. The head snapped back, brains splayed across the armored shoulders. The servitor sank back to its haunches, weapons dropping. Behind Orphos was an Aran, on his knees, focusing through the scope of his sniper rifle. The shot he had fired had blown the back of the servitor's skull out, and he fired a second, shattering what remained. The remnants of the servitor's head hung by a bundle of cables. A target lens fell out to the dirt. "Good kill!" "There's another one over here," voxed Privar. Orphos could see another bunker near Privar's position, which had similarly burst up from the ground. "It failed to activate. I think the biological components have putrefied." "Captain, we're clear," voxed Orphos. "Someone's gone to great pains to keep intruders out." "Good," replied Lysander. "Then we are in the right place." 100 meters ahead was another perimeter, this time of tripwires and motion sensors. Orphos could see them from here, picked out by his training, as if they'd been lit up against the jungle gloom. Beyond them, arched over by trees as if to be invisible from above, was a rockcrete structure, sealed with a heavy steel door. "Looks like a way in. It's underground." "Understood," came Lysander's vox in reply. "Take us in, scouts." The air carried death on it, not just the smell of decay. That was there too, and was as familiar to a space marine as sweat or the smoke from a bolter. It was the sterility of the heavily scrubbed air, the way footsteps on the floor grills had no echo. Life had been torn away, and a stillness remained. Lysander had led the way in. Once a path was secured, the scouts had done their job. A captain among the space marines had a clear duty to lead from the front. He had torn the blast doors open with a swipe of the fist of Dorn. He had kicked his way through the walls of the decontamination chamber he found beyond, and had been the first to walk into the immense chamber of the Rakaban jungles. An enormous shaft sank hundreds of meters straight down. A series of elevators, like suspended cages, gave access to the floors leading off from the shaft. The darkness below did not quite conceal the girders at the base of the shaft. Units used to shred whatever was thrown down there. Whatever happened here, it sometimes produced results that had to be destroyed in a hurry. Squad Sesfin and the assault squad, Septurin, spread out behind Lysander to secure the upper floors. Librarian Dephobus was next in. His armor, painted mostly blue to denote his membership of the chapter librarian, lacked the grime and battle scars of the Imperial Fists. His time on Opus being spent liaisoning with Commander Chikapov and his intelligence staff. "I think we are going to need you here," said Lysander. "Death is everywhere," said Dephobus. "It's thick. I can feel it pushing me back. It doesn't want me here." "The perimeter looks firm," came Orphos's voice from the entrance, where his scouts remained to watch the threats from outside. Kirev and his fire team stuck close to Lysander as he followed Sesfin into a sprawl of laboratories, strewn with benches and equipment. Tissue samples still lay out in the microscope slides. The contents of test tubes and flasks had dried up, leaving rings of sediment. This was just one lab. Half a dozen more made up the upper floor. "Somebody left here fast," said Lysander. "Their work undone. Was it of their own accord?" "It was not," replied Dephobus. The librarian picked up a skull, thoroughly cleaned and lacking its lower jaw, and turned it over in his hand. The cranium was scored across with marks, as if being used as a guide for some surgical procedure. "This floor is clear," Vox Sergeant Sesfin. "We're heading down." Lysander opened the door of a large booth in one lab, hooked up to a generator and surrounded by a ring of crystals, mounted on a metal halo. Inside was a seat, molded to accept human form, with restraints on the ankles, wrists, and neck. Several sizers of calipers hung on the wall, for measuring skull diameters. On another wall were cabinets containing hundreds of glass slides that were preserved slices of brain. A guard post still had a brace of autoguns racked under a desk. "Were they keeping intruders out or the scientists in?" said Kirev. Sesfin was holding position one floor down, where a large room looked into the abyss of the central shaft. The walls were lined with transparent cylinders. All but 3 were empty, and the remaining 3 were human bodies, suspended in viscous, clear fluid. They were naked, and the flesh had become sodden and peeled away from the bones and scraps. Electrodes still hung to the remnants of their scalps. Ribs and organs were visible through the rents in the skin. "These are sleep-teaching units," said Lysander. It was lost on none of the Imperial Fists that the Space Marines were educated in Symbol units, filling their heads with principles of the Codex Astartes and battle philosophy, as they were converted from aspirants. "Open it," said Dephobus. Sergeant Sesfin found a wheel lock at the base of one unit and hauled it open. The bottom of the cylinder swung open, dumping a foul sludge of flesh and organ to the floor. "Cranial surgery," said Lysander, pointing towards the marks on the partially fleshed skull. "The body Orphos brought in from the battle planes had the same scars." Dephobus knelt next to the body. He placed a hand on its skull, just as he had done to Janek Filthhammer. "The dead," he said, "are always more difficult. The last thing he saw was an orderly, a Medicae smock, bionic eyes. These units are all half full." He flicked a switch, and then all goes dark. Then this man died. "Not much to go on," said Lysander. "What else can you see, brother?" Somewhere in the back of Dephobus's mind was a wall with a door set into it. The door was of solid steel, with a lock that could not be picked or broken. Only Dephobus himself could open it. Behind the door was the part of him that had dealt with death. There was so much death around a space marine that his place had to be sealed off, partly by years of hypno-training and mental exercises, and partly by Dephobus's raw mental strength to keep it from being overwhelmed. The door opened. The dead man's memories flooded through. Like his body, they were decayed and fragmented. His brain had turned to mush, and Dephobus imagined himself standing knee-deep in it, scraps of sensations floating past in gory soup. A recurring dream, something that surfaced again and again, was of drowning, fallen to a dark, cold abyss, and struggling for breath, then oblivion. Every time this man had slept, this is what he had seen. Another was of pain, not in waves or great episodes of agony, but constant, a prickling, a direct stimulation of the nerves, and what Dephobus recognized as a treatment to improve reactions, as well as gauge resistance to pain. Dephobus had gone through it himself in the early stages of transformation to a space marine, though those memories seemed to belong to a different man now. And there was nothing. Dephobus sifted through the torn memories. There was just darkness, endless tracks of darkness where a childhood should have been, or an adolescence, or a career as a soldier this man clearly had been. All gone, stripped out, painted over with nothing. Dephobus reversed the flow of memories. They seeped past the death barrier. He crammed them into the space beyond and shut the door. "We have found the source of the off-world troops," said Dephobus. "They're mind-wiped, sleep-taught elites. They were programmed here." "By whom?" said Lysander. "That was scrubbed away," replied Dephobus. "If this man ever knew in the first place." Sergeant Septurian emerged from the archway leading into the side passage. Septurian was an assault veteran, and looked it, his armor carefully painted with dozens of kill markings and trophies of fangs and jawbones hanging from the length of his chainsword. "The rest of the floor is barracks and training rooms," he said. "Nothing to kill." He sounded slightly disappointed. "Any more bodies?" asked Lysander. "Not yet, but it goes down." "Then so do we." "Who do you think built this?" said Dephobus. "Who trained these men?" "I have my own opinions on that," said Lysander, "but I do not place any value in opinions. When it comes to a fact, then I shall act upon it. Septurian, what is on the lower levels?" "I do not know. I do not know, Captain, but something down there is drawing power." Lysander led the way out of the chamber, leaving the sorry remains of the dead soldiers spreading on the floor. Septurian and Dephobus followed, training careful eyes in the shadows that clung everywhere. The light down here was dim, afforded only by a few glow globes. The facility was powered down, running on minimum. The barracks rooms were devoid of decoration, the signs that human beings had lived here, save for the inscriptions carved on the black walls. "In obedience," read one. "In ignorance," read another. Each footlocker contained a single standard imperial prayer book and nothing else. Below, the air was colder. The narrow metal staircase spiraled to the next level of grandeur. The floor here was open in the machine's gnarled teeth. To Lysander's eye, the grinding cylinders looked configured to shred flesh and crunch bone, but he could not be sure. They were clean. Even the oil had been stripped away, and patches of the metal were faintly pitted, as if by acid. A hatch in the floor was sealed by a ward lock, and Lysander knelt to open it. "Wait," said Dephobus. Lysander looked up at him. "The chamber is shielded," said the librarian, "but the sensations beyond are leaking out. Just enough to be sure." "Of what?" "A moral threat." "This world has enough of those," said Lysander. "We will destroy one more. Sesfin, Septurin, at the ready."